meeting the needs of students with disabilities in a general education setting. So here's some things that you need to keep in mind as you are leading an inclusive school. So think about, you're the new principal at a school. What are you going to put on your agenda for the beginning of the school year staff meeting? So some things that I would suggest that you make sure on there are that you have an introduction to your SRBI, RTI, MTSS process so that all the faculty and staff know what it's about. That you introduce the key players who are part of those interventions. Who's part of the support team? What are their responsibilities? Who do you go to if you think a student might be needing those services? You should quickly review IDEA and 504. I would remind them of the responsibilities that they have to follow an IEP or a 504 plan. That hopefully you can prevent some problems in the future if they are reminded of their responsibilities. You want to introduce your special education staff and explain their responsibilities so they know which staff are doing which functions, who to go to when they're having particular challenges. You want to review the role of the general education faculty in the PPT process, follow-up, and data collection. So you want to make sure that they understand what their role is in that as part of that people planning team. I did this one already. You want to review page 8 of the IEP in some way, whether that's that you give teachers and special education teachers who are responsible for students time together, whether folks are giving that to them in advance and then getting together with them to make sure that they've answered any of their questions. You want to make sure that the teachers understand what's on that page 8. You want to talk about frequent and positive communication with family. I think that seems to be a fairly obvious one. I think generally most effective, committed teachers do those things anyways, but you may need to remind some of your faculty, so you may want to just really quickly go remind everyone. You need to review the Connecticut bullying regulations as well, especially in the context of students who fit into disenfranchised groups, like students who are getting special education supports, and a variety of other students who probably are disenfranchised for a whole array of other reasons. You want to make sure that they have their eye out for those bullying kinds of situations. And it's really critical, I think, to provide those teams that time to review the IEP or 504 plan, or time to schedule meetings so that they can review those documents. Unfortunately, several of you have mentioned in class that you were not even told that there were students in your classes that had IEPs or 504 plans, which obviously means that you are not aware of what's in them. I think especially those of you who have multiple students going through your classroom doors on a daily basis, it becomes very difficult to even begin to guess whether you think a student might have one and then to go seek it out. So I think it's really critical that teachers are made aware of who has those plans within the context of the school. So things that you want to think about, some things that we've already talked about, some things that Dr. Margolis talked about in the video that was posted for the previous week is thinking about preparing for a PPT. What would you do differently when you're the administrator? How are you going to make sure that you're ready for those PPTs? And we talked quite a bit about those last week, so I will not go over that again. One of the things that I didn't mention last week that I would encourage you to do is to either assign a staff member to monitor compliance with mandated timelines, or set yourself up so that you have some sort of system. You want to make sure that you do not go over those mandated timelines. You have a certain amount of time to get initial evaluations done. You have a certain amount of time to get an IEP in place after you've done those evaluations. You want to make sure that you don't go over the students' annual review time. You want to make sure that you're getting triannual things done in a timely fashion. So whatever the system is that you think is best to put in place, I would make sure that you have a system that keeps you aware of when those things need to happen. I think that we've talked about many of these other things. The one thing I didn't talk about actually last week was making sure that the parents and guardians have a copy of their rights and that they understand them. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is to direct them to the State Department of Education's website. There's a really good parent guide to the IEP. I would also encourage you to send some of your staff to look at those things. I think they tend to write them less jargon when they write for the parents. So I think it's a much more readable document for everyone. So I would encourage you to do that, and also to encourage them to take a look at the IEP site that I believe I linked you to in the previous module, that explains what all the different parts of the IEP are, especially for those folks who are not within the context of the special education department. It's much easier to understand what you're reading when you know why those things are there. So I think we talked about this last week. Difficult meetings, try not to take it personally. I know it's really hard to not feel that way, especially if you feel that you have been doing what's in the best interest of the child. But the other thing you need to remember is really the parents and guardians, their job is to advocate for that child. So we may not always understand why they're asking for certain things. We may not understand why they're reacting in certain ways. Oftentimes, I think I could probably almost guarantee that much of what's happening is parents feel like they're not really respected as part of a team. So they oftentimes have, they have hurt feelings, or they're defensive because they really feel like folks are not listening to them. So some things to think about as you're planning for supporting students within the context of your schools. As you're thinking about how am I putting my classrooms together, what does next year look like, you want to make sure that you're thinking about how many students are in a class. And we're going to talk about some elementary considerations first, and then we'll kind of build on those for middle school, high school. You want to limit the number of students that are in a particular class that have IEPs. You don't want to overload one particular classroom with all the students who have a particular disability, or one or two teachers with all the students who have IEPs. I know a lot of times folks do that. They bunch them all together because they say that that's the way that the special ed teacher or the speech pathologist or whoever can see those students with a number of hours that are dedicated to them within the context of their IEP. The unfortunate thing that happens is when you do that, and I think we may have even discussed this in class, is you start running a general education classroom that looks an awful lot like a segregated special ed room. And it makes it much more difficult for students to make friends and to really become part of a classroom environment if you have too many students who have too many needs in one particular class. Well, obviously, you have to think about where are students going. Some teachers are better with certain types of students who have disabilities than others, but when you don't have teachers who have capacity, you have to think about how do I build their capacity. I'm not just going to let them never have students who have IEPs in their class. I need to help them have the skills that they need to be able to be effective instructors of a diverse group of students. You want to make sure that the people who need to know things about a particular student know. And this is one of those, I think, misunderstandings of FERPA. We certainly don't want everyone to know every little thing about a student. There's certain things that people may not necessarily need to know, but there's a variety of folks who need to know things, and schools have a tendency to not tell them. So if a student goes to a reading interventionist, you may not need to tell them all of the details of the parent's divorce and how ugly it's gotten and blah, 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 blah. But if that child's upset about that and is not able to express it, it's probably really helpful to let that specialist know what's going on in some more general, abbreviated version. Folks that are responsible for watching students at recess, oftentimes they're not necessarily the people who are assigned to them in the classroom. There's things that sometimes those folks need to know in order to make sure that they're keeping students safe. If there's a student who has a bee allergy, the person who's overseeing recess really needs to know that. It's not a piece of information that shouldn't be shared. It could be a matter of life and death for some students. Cafeteria staff, bus drivers, sometimes folks in the front office need to know things. So you want to make sure that people have the information that they need to support that child effectively. Doesn't mean that they know everything that's in that student's file, but they may need to know different parts of it. The IEP is really the way you're going to determine the use of a paraprofessional. So I think we had this conversation as a group about how to make sure that students are getting the right level of support. Do all students who have a particular diagnosis need a one-to-one paraprofessional? Not necessarily. Some might. If a student has a one-to-one paraprofessional, why do they have that one-to-one para? Are they a student with really significant healthcare needs and somebody needs to be right on top of them to make sure that they're not having some kind of medical crisis? Are they students who have really significant behavioral needs and someone needs to be within arm's distance of them? More often than not, probably about 90% of students do not need a para who looks like a shadow, who's like stuck to them, like they've been attached by Velcro. More often than not, that paraprofessional can assist and move away a little bit. Assist and move away a little bit. So the reality is when we start this, here's your shadow will follow you everywhere. At the elementary school level, these students never gain any independence. You want to think about the placement carefully and make sure there's the appropriate level of support. If you have a school-wide behavioral, social, emotional plan, it should apply to all students at your school, unless a student has an individualized positive behavior support plan. And I would encourage whoever it is that's writing the individualized positive behavior support plan to incorporate in as many things that are part of the school-wide approach as are appropriate for that particular child. We think about the secondary piece. All the same considerations as elementary. You want to think about the student's schedule. You might be able to make a choice between two teachers of a particular content area. One of them is a much more hands-on, activity-based kind of classroom. The other one may have more of a stand and deliver approach. You have a student who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder who likes to move around. The teacher who does more hands-on things might be a better choice for them. You want to think about what your expectations are. For some students, you might even need to take into account where the classroom is. You may think about a student's schedule by trying to cut down on the number of places that they need to go within the context of a building by, I can put them in this math class, which happens to be 2 doors down from their English class, as opposed to putting them in the math class that is clear on the other side of the building. You want to think about who's in that class. And you want to think about that obviously at the elementary school as well, but I think it's a little easier sometimes at the elementary level to try to think about who's together. Sometimes there's certain students who really just honestly, it's not a good idea for them to be together, and when they end up together, it just creates problems for everybody. So you want to try to think about that. How can I maybe potentially avoid that? Who within the context of the special education department is assigned to those students, and how much time do they need with them? So you probably don't want to schedule your special education teacher who is housed in the auxiliary building outside your school for a student who maybe needs them to be able to be available to them quickly. We want to think about transition planning by age 16 unless the parent or guardian asks for it earlier. It can be done as early as 14 on parental request. So one of the things that should happen at age 16 is we need to start thinking about, where is this student going? Is this student going out into the workforce? Is this student going to get additional services from 18 to 21, which remember IDEA says you can have an education until age 21. Is this student going to graduate with their class and go off to college? At which point I would encourage you to remind some of your students that there are services and supports that are legally available to them at the university level. So if they have had an IEP or a 504 plan at the university level through the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, they are still guaranteed services. They are not going to get modifications in college classes, but they certainly can get accommodations in college classes. You want to think about what happens when this student is getting support services. I suspect those of you who spend your time in some of the older classes, some of you who are at middle schools and high schools, know students who will do whatever it is that they can to avoid having someone support them in situations where their non-disabled peers are there. They don't want people to know maybe that they're getting supports. Does it create some kind of stigma? So it works much better if the special education supports are done in a way that that teacher is available to everybody. One of the groups will talk about co-teaching. So that might be a way to provide a student who needs some supports with the supports that they need in a way that causes them less stigma. Sometimes students need things that they don't want. Some students who have hearing impairments don't want the teachers to use the FM communication system as they get older. They tell them, oh, I forgot the microphone in the other class, or it's not charged, or they take the batteries out, or whatever. Those things are really problematic because they're not able to get the full experience of that classroom. So we need to try to help them understand that it's okay to use those things and that we all use a variety of different things to get us through the day. So that oftentimes needs to be done in an educational way, probably earlier on in elementary school, so that their peers recognize that everybody gets something. It's just we all get different things. You want to make sure that students are included in the planning. Sometimes they'll tell you, I don't really need help in my English class, but I really need it in my math class. And somebody might have been planning the schedule in a completely different way. You want to help the student develop self-advocacy skills. I can tell you without any hesitation, students will advocate for themselves, but oftentimes if we don't teach them how to do it in appropriate ways, they will do it in ways that we don't like. Whether it's through some kind of problematic behaviors, whether it's avoidance, whether it's just, saying yes, but really not doing what it was that folks were hoping that they would do. So it's really important for them to be able to speak up for themselves and in ways that are more potentially maybe respectful and more like a team player, because they're going to need to do those things when they get older and get into the workforce, depending upon what it is that they're doing in the future. We want to think about extracurricular activities. So if there are extracurricular activities that are provided to the rest of the school population, then students who have an IEP should have an opportunity for those activities. So if there is, let's say, theater club, and a student wants to join the theater group, and the student has an IEP, then that student should be afforded the opportunity to do that. We can't say things like it's too dangerous, we're going to not do that because they might get hurt. There was a student, I want to say, it might have been in West Hartford, maybe about a year or so ago, a middle schooler who started running on the cross-country team. He was a youngster with cerebral palsy. And if you've ever seen a cross-country course, most of the time it looks kind of dangerous. It's bumpy. It's trail running. But he really wanted to be on the cross-country team, and the cross-country team welcomed him. The coach appeared to have done a really nice job with him. I think it shows up on one of the nightly news segments in the Connecticut Nightly News. And he's not super coordinated. He's fallen down probably a lot of times and skinned his knees and, bruised his elbows or whatever. But it wasn't life and death dangerous for him to do that. So, of course, he should be able to do that. I think he was probably the last person who came in from the run. But he should be afforded the opportunity to be part of those things. Now, obviously, if someone wants to join the swim team and they don't know how to swim, then there's a real danger there. But we cannot say students can't participate in activities because we deem it to be too dangerous or problematic. Sometimes a student might need some adult support for those things. So if you have a student who has a paraprofessional, one of the things that you might want to be thinking about is, does that student need that para for every single thing that's going on during the course of the day? Or could that para's hours be skewed differently? Maybe the student doesn't need the para for the first hour or so in the morning. So the para comes in an hour later, stays an hour longer, has the same length of a day, but goes to the after-school activity with the student instead. I think sometimes we just need to be creative. So some things I would encourage you to do as you are trying to plan for supporting students within the context of your classes in your school as a leader. How are you planning the makeup of the classes? How are you planning schedules? The thing that you need to do is you need to build everything with the students with IEPs and 504s as the first priority. So you want to place them into the classrooms first and then fill them with other students. When you try to fill your classes randomly with other students and then try to squish them in at the end, it almost always doesn't work. So they need to be the first folks you plan for, and then you do the rest of the school. So creating a resource map is a good idea so that you have, ideas for curriculum instruction and learning. Think about the environment. What does the environment look like? Are there things that we need to do to the environment to make sure that it is more appropriate for a particular student? What do we know about how that student's going to take assessments? How are we going to monitor progress? We need to think about that. We need to think about overall decision making. What kind of staffing will you need for students? What's the schedule look like? What do you already have? What's already there? What works? What doesn't work? What would you change? What teaching and support staff do you have that are available? What is their schedule like? What kinds of instructional materials do you have? We talked about students with visual issues the last time that we were together. So if you knew that you were getting a student who was blind at your school, you need to start thinking about the materials that they need in advance. If you were going to get them large print books, you need to do that about 2 years in advance. So we need to kind of think about those things as soon as we can. Do you need outside resources to make something happen? Looking at a student who has a significant visual impairment, you may need to be contacting the Services for the Blind at the State Department, contacting BESB. If you had a student who had some augmentative communication needs, maybe they needed a voice output communication device, and you do not have anyone within the context of your school district that would be able to evaluate that student's ability to use different types of equipment, order the equipment, set the equipment up, etc., you may need to get some outside folks to be able to do that. So you want to think about what kinds of resources are you going to need for students. So what do you need to do to make your school inclusive? First of all, the thing is you need a team. You're not going to be able to accomplish this alone. You need to make sure that there's other folks that are helping you do this. You may actually need other folks to help you figure out the schedule too, because I think putting together a schedule is oftentimes like putting together a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes multiple heads are better than one. You want to be as flexible as possible. Being flexible oftentimes will be the answer to solving a problem or not solving it. What resources do you have? I think we have conversations frequently about whether there's enough paraprofessional supports. Do we have enough paras? Do we not have enough paras? Do we have too many paras? It depends upon who you talk to. When you talk to folks that are doing the budget, they think you have too many paras. When you talk to classroom teachers, they think you have too few. But you may just have them in the wrong places. So you want to think about who's doing what, where are they doing it, and how can this be done most efficiently and effectively. As I said earlier, it's easier to create your inclusive classes first and then build a master schedule around that. Ask for help. As I said earlier, scheduling is really a lesson in problem solving. So, find your best problem solvers. I'm completely convinced that there's a person on the autism spectrum who's going to create some kind of program at some point in time that's going to make this so much easier for all of us. There's a resource for scheduling, differentiated instruction, etc. that I would encourage you to take a look at. I'll also post that within the context of the modules. So thinking about guidelines for in-school and out-of-school suspensions, I think we talked about this a little bit when we talked about legal things. We need to make sure that students with disabilities, we're making sure that their particular issue that may have created someone thinking that they should be suspended or either in school or out of school, that it's not a manifestation of their disability. So one of the things that we have to think about is if you have a student who has a disability who's in-school suspension, does that in-school suspension count towards days of suspension? If the in-school suspension is counted toward days of suspension, there needs to be a FAPE, and the procedural consequences need to be followed because that student is being taken out of their appropriate educational environment. In-school suspension days do not count towards days of suspension as long as the student is able to continue to appropriately participate in the general curriculum. So if a student is being isolated in that in-school suspension and not having contact with non-disabled peers and they were supposed to be in an inclusive environment, then it wouldn't count as being able to appropriately participate in the general education environment. So it really depends upon what's happening in the in-school suspension. If the student continues to receive the services that they get in their IEP, and as I mentioned already, that they still have contact with typically developing peers in the way that they typically would have. If a child with a disability receives FAPE during a school suspension, if all three of the previous criteria are met, then the time spent serving an in-school suspension is not counted toward days of suspension allowed under IDEA. If the child did not have the same level of participation, then those days will count as suspensions as allowed under IDEA. If the district has an in-school suspension setting that's available to children with and without disabilities, and time with the non-disabled peers criteria is met, even if on a given day that child with the disability is the only child placed in there, then FAPE would still be considered to be okay. But if you created an isolated environment for them, it would not be. If it just happened to be that they were the only kid in school suspension that day, you're still meeting FAPE. So some things we need to think about as we look at short-term suspensions. If they keep happening and you end up with multiples, it really could start kicking into procedural safeguards. So if a student has been subjected to a series of removals, that constitutes a pattern of exclusion from school because the series of removals total more than 10 days in a school year, and the child's behavior is substantially similar to the child's behavior in previous incidents that resulted in the removals, and additional factors such as the length of removal, the total amount of time the child has been removed, and the proximity of the removals to another. So here's the problem. They've been out of the classroom too long. It's a change of placement. So if that keeps happening, you're going to need to reconvene the PPT and have a different kind of discussion. I would suspect that if you have a student who keeps having multiple short-term removals and they're having those perhaps for a very particular type of reason, like usually those things are things that you've been incredibly aggressive and extremely violent, there may be a need for that child to be getting different types of services. So you really need to convene that PPT. The third issue is that the content of FAPE provided to students with disabilities during in-school suspension. So to summarize, a child with a disability could be removed to in-school suspension if a child with a disability will not continue to appropriately participate in the general education curriculum, not receive the services on the IEP, and not participate with non-disabled children to the extent they would have previously, the time in school suspension must be counted towards days of suspension for purposes in determining whether there's FAPE. District may need to determine if there's a change of placement. So one of the things you really need to think about is what happens when a student keeps getting sent to the office. Those ultimately end up being multiple in-school kinds of suspensions. An hour here, an hour there, half a day here, another half a day there. It may not be an in-school suspension room, but the principal's office starts looking like a change in placement. So you need to be really careful about students spending time in the office. Other thing is that you need to make sure that you're providing a manifestation determination, that an FBA is being done, and that a student's behavior intervention plan is either written or revised to make sure that that student is getting the appropriate educational services. So we will spend some time in a group looking at some administrative challenges. I will send you those scenarios in a document to your emails so that you have those in advance of our class.